One U.S. tariff announcement threatens to wipe out a pharmaceutical industry worth $30 billion a year, the same industry supplying 1 in 5 generic medicines on Earth. India now operates more USFDA-approved pharma facilities than any country on Earth outside America, built facility by facility over 30 years. Can the India-UK trade deal absorb the shock, when even tripling those exports still leaves the UK worth just 3% of India's total pharma trade? India's trillion rupee innovation fund and third country manufacturing arbitrage are both real strategies. One returns after 2029, the other costs $100 million most of the sector simply doesn't have. None of India's 5 strategies bridges the gap alone. What 2029 actually produces isn't collapse, it's structural sorting, and the smallest players won't survive it intact. Let's break down exactly how India's pharmaceutical industry got here, what a 200% tariff cliff actually destroys, and which players survive the sorting that's coming. India holds more USFDA-approved pharma facilities than any nation outside America. What happens to India's 10,500 manufacturing units if the US eliminates foreign generic dependence through a 200% tariff cliff before relocation approvals clear? To answer that, you first need to know what that USFDA ranking actually means. Every Indian facility on that list cleared the same tough inspection standard required of a plant in Ohio or Texas. Sterile manufacturing, documentation audits, supply chain traceability. India didn't stumble into this. It built toward it, facility by facility, over 30 years. And the scale behind that track record is genuinely staggering. Over 3,000 pharmaceutical companies, roughly 10,500 manufacturing units, 60 therapeutic areas, antibiotics, antivirals, oncology, cardiovascular. These aren't single molecule assembly lines. They're diversified operations that took decades to staff, certify, and scale. Relocating even a fraction of that capacity isn't a problem you solve in one budget cycle. A new greenfield pharma facility takes 5 to 7 years from groundbreaking to a first FDA-cleared batch. And that assumes no queue delays. The timeline math simply doesn't work. The world leans hard on this infrastructure. India supplies roughly 1 in 5 generic medicines consumed globally and meets about 60% of international vaccine demand. That's not an abstract export statistic. It's the antibiotic a child in sub-Saharan Africa receives, or the generic insulin a diabetic patient in rural America fills at the pharmacy counter. So when you put a 200% tariff wall in front of that supply, the ripple goes far beyond a trade dispute. India's pharmaceutical exports crossed $30.47 billion in financial year 2025, a 9.4% year-on-year rise held through global supply disruptions and post-pandemic demand shifts. That growth reflects how deeply embedded Indian generics are in keeping drug costs manageable for American patients and insurers. A 200% tariff wall, set to land August 1st, 2029, would price Indian generics out of the US market almost overnight. American manufacturers don't have the certified capacity to absorb that volume, not even close. Patients would pay more, and a supply chain built carefully over 3 decades would face sudden, unplanned stress across multiple markets at once. India built something that rivals domestic American manufacturing in regulatory credibility. Whether that infrastructure can be protected or shielded through diplomacy fast enough is now the defining question, and the answer will arrive well before 2020. 0 tariffs until 2028, then 200%. A legislated cliff designed to onshore manufacturing. Is India's strategic response? UK FTA diversification, global south expansion, PLI-backed API self-sufficiency. Arithmetically sufficient against a 200% tariff cliff that arrives in 3 years? To answer that, honestly, you have to go back further than most coverage does. For 3 decades, the US-India pharmaceutical relationship was quietly symbiotic. America wanted affordable generics to hold down healthcare costs. India wanted scale, hard currency, and US FDA credibility to export everywhere else. That arrangement was never locked in a treaty. It was maintained by mutual convenience, and convenience can be legislated away overnight. The US generics import bill ran into the tens of billions annually, and India supplied roughly a third of it. That is not a niche position. It is structural dependency on both sides, and it is precisely that centrality which made India a policy target. For now, the window is still open. 0 tariffs on imported generics hold until August 1st, 2028, a runway that feels long until you map what is waiting at the end of it. Then the cost doubles overnight. 100% for exactly 1 year. Not a transition, a warning shot. Then 200%. This is not a negotiating posture. It is a legislated expiration date on India's current US market access, written into statute. Now consider the 10,500 manufacturing units that built their revenue models around that access. These are not monoliths. Most are mid-sized, USFDA-approved exporters, deeply compliant, thinly margined, with no pre-existing footprint outside India. A 200% tariff does not squeeze their margins. It erases the business case entirely. And unlike a large multinational that can absorb a transition year, these units have no geographic buffer ready to deploy. Firms that break ground in India today on US-bound capacity still miss the tariff deadline by years. The investment is committed before the access is lost, meaning the capital destruction is not hypothetical, it is sequenced. The exit that does exist, routing US-bound production through non-Indian facilities, the geographic arbitrage China's solar sector ran against earlier tariff waves, belongs almost exclusively to multinationals with established regional footprints. It does not belong to the majority of those 10,500 units. This is the hidden causal chain. India spent 30 years building the world's deepest USFDA-compliant base outside America, and that earned concentration is exactly what a single US statute can now hold hostage. Every strategic response is real. None of them closes a 2-year gap between a 3-year deadline and a 5-year regulatory clock. The arithmetic does not balance, and the units most exposed are the ones least able to relocate. UK exports may triple under CETA, but still represent only 3% of India's total pharma exports. What happens to India's $30.47 billion pharma export base if UK and Global South markets cannot numerically replace US volumes before the 2029 tariff cliff? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, and the India-UK trade deal, for all its genuine ambition, is where the math gets brutal. To understand why CETA matters and why it still falls short, you need the backstory. For decades, the United States absorbed India's generic pharmaceutical output at scale, peaking at roughly 31% of total pharma export revenues. That relationship wasn't purely commercial, it was structural. US FDA clearances became the gold standard Indian manufacturers chased. American hospital systems became the primary volume anchor and US pricing. Even post-Hatch-Waxman generic competition remained generous by global standards. When Washington began signaling punitive tariff postures in 2024, India's pharma lobby didn't panic immediately, because diversification had been a stated policy goal for years. The uncomfortable truth was that diversification had been slow. The UK deal was meant to change the conversation. The India-UK Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement isn't a minor bilateral tweak. It's a structural renegotiation years in the making, and for pharma specifically, the core offer is significant. CETA eliminates tariffs on nearly all pharmaceutical products entering the UK market. MHRA-registered Indian manufacturers, those already cleared for NHS procurement, gain an immediate cost edge over competitors still paying duties. That matters in a tender-driven system where margin differences of 2 or 3% determine contract outcomes. The agreement also opens pathways for regulatory data sharing, which compresses the approval timeline for new Indian generics seeking UK market entry. Faster approval plus zero tariff is genuinely valuable architecture. It pulls investment, attracts FDI, and deepens the institutional relationship between Indian generics houses and UK healthcare procurement bodies. What it cannot do, structurally, is manufacture volume that isn't there. Watch the bar chart rise, and then watch how far it still has to go. In FY25-26, India's pharmaceutical exports to the UK reached $902.96 million, a solid number in isolation. Pharmaceutical projects that figure crosses $981 million in FY26-27, an 8.66% increase. Clean upward momentum. The chart looks encouraging until you zoom out. Formulations and biologicals already drive 89.54% of that UK export base. This isn't raw bulk chemistry being shipped at commodity margins. It's the high-value, high-complexity end of what Indian pharma has spent 20 years building. The product mix is right. The destination is just too small, because even at $981 million, even tripled under the most optimistic CETA scenario, the UK represents roughly 3% of India's $30.47 billion export total. 8.66% growth on 3% of your base is still 3% of your base. That's the geopolitical irony embedded in the bridge too short problem. India proved it can build sophisticated trade architecture, sovereign-level agreements, basically regulatory harmonization, long-term market positioning. CETA is real. Its benefits to NHS patients accessing affordable medicines are real. The FDI it attracts is real. but the US tariff threat operates at a volume that no single bilateral agreement can absorb alone. A 200% tariff on the market, absorbing nearly a third of your export revenues, cannot be offset by growing a 3% market by 9% annually. The timelines don't converge before 2029. India isn't holding one strategy, it's holding three simultaneously. US manufacturing relocation that takes 5+ years, UK diversification that's structurally undersized, and domestic innovation that compounds over decades. CETA deepens one leg of that stool. What the next piece has to confront is whether all three legs together are enough, or whether the arithmetic simply doesn't close. Basically, India's 1 trillion rupees innovation fund is structurally correct, but returns arrive after the 2029 cliff. Can India's 1 trillion rupees RDI innovation fund and PLI-backed API self-sufficiency deliver returns before the 2029 tariff cliff eliminates US market access? That is the central tension, and the answer requires pulling apart every layer of this policy architecture. Start with the fund itself. This is not a subsidy or a market patch. It is a deliberate attempt to shift what India manufactures, not just where it ships. 1 trillion rupees committed to research, development, and innovation. That scale signals a sovereign bet. India intends to compete on molecules, not just on manufacturing margins. BIRIC, the government's Biotech Research Council, is already selecting the first wave of recipients. And the selection architecture is precise. 5 startups: Firmbox Bio, Revelations Biotech, 4 Base Care, C6 Energy, Tellurus Biotech, each receiving roughly 25 crore rupees. That capital does something beyond funding a lab. It is institutional validation, the signal that attracts private venture money and converts a research team into a commercial pipeline. India built this selection mechanism deliberately. That discipline matters. But it does not change what happens next, because the timeline is where the architecture fractures. Here's where the numbers stop adding up. A novel therapeutic requires 7 to 10 years from discovery to commercial market. Clinical trials, regulatory dossiers, FDA review cycles, none of which compress on policy timelines. The RDI fund's real returns land well into the 2030s, structurally correct, chronologically misaligned with a 2029 deadline that does not negotiate. The API story runs exactly the same logic, just at a different clock speed. PLI-backed API self-sufficiency, breaking China's grip on key starting materials like penicillin G and paracetamol intermediates. Demands 3 to 5 years for facility construction, environmental clearances, WHO, GMP certification, and USFDA pre-approval inspections. That is the optimistic case. Greenfield sites regularly run longer. The foundation arrives after the cliff, not before it. And that gap is not a planning failure so much as a structural reality. No innovation cycle compresses to fit a political deadline. Yet one strand of the response moves faster than the rest. AI-enabled players like Jexon Vision are positioned to capture the manufacturing modernization wave now. Predictive quality control, automated visual inspection, real-time batch analytics. Indian producers facing tariff-exposed margin compression need these tools immediately, not in a decade. That part of the response does not wait for a drug approval cycle. But that efficiency gain, however real, cannot substitute for the market access question the UK FTA module left open. We established there that neither UK trade volumes nor Global South markets can absorb what a 200% US tariff displaces. The RDI fund is India's answer to that structural vulnerability, just not its answer by 2029. The statistical anomaly is not that the fund is wrong. It is that India's unmatched USFDA facility depth, the very asset that built US market dominance, now creates a cliff that the innovation timeline cannot clear in time. The right bets are in place. Whether India can hold US market position long enough to cash the innovation dividend is the question this entire breakdown has been building toward, and the answer determines whether 1 trillion rupees becomes a foundation or a monument to mistiming. Not all 10,500 Indian pharma units face equal risk. Geographic arbitrage saves only the well-capitalized. What happens to India's 3,000 pharma companies if only well-capitalized players can afford third-country manufacturing arbitrage while the majority face the 2029 tariff cliff? That split, between those who can move and those who cannot, is the real story underneath every headline about Indian generics surviving US tariffs. Every strategy we have walked through so far arrives after the wall goes up. UK diversification, RDI innovation pipelines, API self-sufficiency. Each lands post-2029, but one play could theoretically beat the deadline. It requires capital most of this sector does not have. Some of India's larger manufacturers already hold production footprints in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The logic is clean. Shift US-bound volumes through those third country facilities before tariffs apply. Keep Indian plants serving the UK, the global south, and the domestic market. The American buyer receives the same molecule. The tariff clock never starts. If that sounds familiar, it should. This is exactly what Chinese solar manufacturers executed when the first wave of US tariffs arrived. Production rerouted through Vietnam and Malaysia virtually overnight. The panels still came from Chinese supply chains, just with a different address on the export paperwork. Geographic diversification as a tariff shield. India's well-capitalized pharma players are reading from that same playbook, and some are already several chapters in. But the playbook has a price that the solar analogy obscures. Building a USFDA-compliant pharmaceutical facility in Vietnam, Mexico, or any comparable jurisdiction costs $50 to $100 million per unit, roughly equivalent to constructing one inside the United States itself. Land is cheaper. Labor is cheaper. The compliance infrastructure is not cheaper, because it cannot be. The FDA does not grade on geography. A manufacturing site in Hanoi faces the same inspection standard, the same data integrity requirements, and the same consequence of import alerts as a site in Hyderabad. When a tariff changes, the regulator does not move with it. That means the full capital commitment, $50 to $100 million, plus 2 to 3 years to reach operational approval, is non-negotiable regardless of which low-cost country you choose. For a handful of large Indian exporters, this is a significant but manageable capital deployment. For most of the sector, it is something else entirely. India built 3,000 pharma companies, a genuine industrial achievement spanning decades. The overwhelming majority are mid-sized or small exporters operating on margins that make a $100 million overseas bet structurally impossible, not merely difficult. What that arithmetic produces is bifurcation. A concentrated cohort of large, internationally diversified players will use geographic arbitrage to protect U.S. market access. The rest face the 2029 tariff cliff with no equivalent escape. And that pressure resolves in one direction: accelerated consolidation, where smaller exporters survive only by being absorbed into the balance sheets of the players who already solved the problem before the deadline arrived. No single strategy solves 2029. India must pursue all 5 simultaneously and accept some will fail. Actually, which of India's 5 strategic responses? US relocation, UK diversification, Global South expansion, RDI innovation, third country arbitrage, actually bridges the gap before the 2029 tariff cliff? That is the question this entire breakdown has been building toward, and the honest answer is uncomfortable. None of them does it alone, not one. But here's the deeper problem that most of the commentary misses. The timeline mismatch between each strategy's maturation window and the cliff's arrival date isn't a fixable engineering problem. It is the central, defining fact of India's pharmaceutical predicament. And understanding why requires sitting with each strategy's numbers long enough to feel the pressure they generate. Take US manufacturing relocation first. USFDA facility approvals, greenfield construction, validation cycles. That pipeline runs 5 years minimum, and that is an optimistic read. The tariff cliff lands in 3. You cannot compress that arithmetic through political goodwill or investment announcements. The calendar is the constraint. The UK pivot carries its own ceiling. Zero tariff access under any renegotiated framework is genuinely valuable. But the UK market's absolute size means that even tripling current Indian pharmaceutical exports there still doesn't numerically replace what a 200% US tariff removes from the ledger. It is a cushion. It is not a substitute. So if the 2 most discussed responses both hit structural walls, what about the longer horizon bets? The RDI fund's pipeline is a genuinely important foundation, but novel therapeutic commercialization runs 7 to 10 years, and even building out API capacity takes 3 to 5. Both investments are correct. Neither is a 2029 answer. They are the architecture for what India becomes after the cliff forces the first painful reckoning. Third country arbitrage. Standing up compliant manufacturing in a tariff-exempt jurisdiction, the Chinese solar playbook applied to pharma, costs $50 to $100 million per facility. That is unambiguously a Tier 1 balance sheet play. Mid-sized exporters cannot capitalize it. Smaller players cannot even model it seriously, which means arbitrage amplifies the divergence between large and small rather than solving the sector's collective problem. This is where the editorial verdict sharpens into something specific. What 2029 produces is not sector collapse, it is structural sorting. Large, diversified firms survive through geographic arbitrage and innovation pivots. Mid-sized players consolidate through M and AMP-A, gaining the scale to run multiple strategies at once. Smaller exporters redirect to alternative geographies and exit the US market, not permanently, but until the regulatory and tariff environment shifts again. India has built the deepest USFDA-compliant manufacturing base outside America. 3,000 companies, $30 billion in annual exports. That doesn't disappear under tariff pressure. It concentrates, sharpens, and emerges more innovation-led than the volume-driven model that preceded it. The 2029 deadline is not the end of India's pharmaceutical ambition. It is the specific, datable moment when the industry's next structural form becomes impossible to delay any further. Follow us for more updates like this. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to follow us on YouTube.